Humility, equity, anti-racism, lateral kindness, inclusivity, and trauma-informed, these are key aspects that we as a collective are asked to bring into our everyday lives, our work lives, so we can share space with each other, with humility, with kindness. I'm so excited to bring in amazing voices, social change leaders in the Prince George area, so that together we can hear about why it matters, what got them interested in what they represent in the community, and maybe even some tips for other leaders in the community of how to best serve all people. I'm really looking forward to this journey together. Welcome to another episode of Hope and Healing in the North. Today we are discussing with Lake Atlas all about equity. What is equity? How do we know when we're making key equitable choices for those that we serve in our work, in the community, and in our day-to-day lives? I really hope that you enjoy this episode, and thanks for tuning in. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name's Lake, and my pronouns are he, they. I was born here in Prince George, and I'm from McLeod Lake territory, Sakanay territory, but my mother, I'm adopted into my family. My mother is Carrier, so that's the culture that I've been taught. I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks. What are you up to in the community right now?
I work mostly in Peersport. That's my job. And so what Peersport is, if you're unfamiliar, is exactly what it sounds like, supporting peers around my age just by being a friend. And that could look like hanging out with you and having a conversation about something really mundane or not as deep. It could be playing video games together. It could just look like being a friend to you. Or it could be something a bit more complex, like doing life skills, teaching you how to write a resume, going to teach you how to get your government ID, or sometimes I host movie nights. And that's been really successful, really fun. Just watch movies with other people and talk about how it critiques society and how we view that and what it's portraying. Yeah, Peersport. And right now I'm a full-time student.
Oh, you're busy.
Yes.
So it sounds like equity plays into your work a lot. And so you're the equity social change leader that's here speaking on the behalf of what equity means. And I'm curious what it means to you.
Yeah, so equity, we talked about this a little bit before. I think it's pretty complex and it's going to look different for everybody. And, I can be a Peersport to some people, but I can't be a Peersport to everybody because I only have certain perspectives. I think if I had somebody like me growing up, I'd be more certain of who I was growing up and more, I guess, understanding. Yeah, equity, like I said, it's just going to look different for everybody. Just really meeting people where they're at and being receptive to what they're asking you. And just being really intentional in the words you're saying and how you're listening.
So when someone is less equitable in society, what does that mean? Like when they have less, does that mean they have less advantage than other folks? What does it mean when someone is experiencing inequity?
Yeah, it's a complex answer. It's not something we could cover in a few sentences, but I guess I would say, just being treated in an unfair way. So I guess an example, I'll use myself as an example. I get followed quite frequently when I enter stores, even if I'm going grocery shopping or I'm just at the gas station getting a snack, and it's not very fair. Or it could look like not having enough accessibility in a certain building or a certain area. So I recognize in a lot of parking lots it's not very accessible for people who use walkers or people who have wheelchairs. Again, treated unfairly. And it's a very systematic thing. It's intertwined with the colonial lens of how cities are built. So it's a pretty complex answer. And it's going to look different for everybody.
I agree. I'm going to pull a card. So these are cards against inequity. And this one is, what are systemic barriers? Systemic barriers are patterns of behavior, policies or practices that are part of the social or administrative structures of an organization and which create or perpetuate a position of relative disadvantage for equity-seeking groups. For example, posters, flyers that don't visually represent diversity, policies and procedures that don't recognize community diversity needs, program intake with built-in barriers, such as only assisting people in person, not by phone. So systemic barriers are just the ways, like you said, the colonial system is set up in a certain way, then that doesn't allow for some people to access what the majority population might be able to.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's just so many things that really go into it, and so many of it is systematic, or so much of it rather is systematic. Yeah, I could think of so many different things for me that's been a barrier to really basic things that I need and that everybody needs. Yeah, just I think one big thing that really affects a huge portion of the population, at least in Canada, I could say, is the medical care system or anything related to it. There was a lot of speculation when the government stated that they wanted, or that they offered the COVID vaccines to the Indigenous people first, because historically it's been known that the government would, for lack of better words, test on Indigenous people, test medical stuff on Indigenous people, and a lot of the times it would end horrifically. And so there was a lot of speculation. I know a lot of my elders refused to get it because they were afraid of the complications that might come with it. And I myself waited for a long time. Like it was just really the same things. They have medical trauma and fear of medical neglect, and ultimately it does end in death for some people, and it can be just horrific, really. Yeah.
So even when you're working with people in peer support, sometimes those barriers are even how they do the paperwork or how different organizations do paperwork. Are there any other examples that for you personally, you talked about how you have had your personal experiences. Is there anything you want to share about that?
Yeah, in peer support, one of the places I work, I should say, we try to keep the paperwork very minimal, and we offer to do the paperwork with them or to fill it out and they can just tell us. And it's just one page. We try to keep it as short as possible, but of course we need those paperwork done because it does give us our sponsors and the money to keep the program going. But you're right in that it does cause disparities and people who don't read or people who just don't really, might have bigger worries than filling out a piece of paper. I guess for my own examples, I can't really think of any. In school, again, we talked about this a little bit before, I struggle a lot with like the Western colonial way of teaching and learning, and I don't think testing somebody on their ability to memorize stuff is a very good testing of their knowledge. And I just think that there's better ways to test a person's knowledge, and I know it's more complex than just changing the way people teach and changing the way that people learn or adapting it to how a person learns. And I know it's more complex than I might be making it out to be, but I also think
it's not that complex to change different assessment styles.
I think, I don't think it's unattainable. I think it's complex, but I don't think it's unattainable. Yeah.
Yeah. When you look at when you went back to school, like how was that? Was it very confronting of different ideologies that are quite Western, and do you have to conform to fit in, or did you feel like you were very welcome and as you feel who you are in your identity?
Yeah, so actually, I haven't really told anybody about this because I'm trying to move past it. But when I was applying to college, so I studied at our college before under a different name. And so when I came back and I applied again, they said that, I don't know, there was this whole thing, and they asked me for my legal change of name document because, I don't know, something to do about stats, which I understand. But it was annoying to have to go through extra steps because they failed to mention that if you change your name, you have to bring your legal change of name document, that could have easily been put on their website during the application process. And it was pretty annoying, honestly. And I think also the language that the person used in the administration office was not very, I don't know if I would say professional, but it just wasn't really, he just seemed very disconnected with the people that he was serving, which, I don't know, maybe he was having a bad day or whatever the case might be. But yeah, it was difficult to apply, and it was not that difficult before. Whatever the case might be, it is what it is.
The names can be really important to some people, right? And to Indigenous people.
Yeah.
Having the name that you are choosing.
Yeah. In terms of adapting my way of, my way of life and my way of learning to go back to school, like I said, I studied at the college before, and I studied in trades, but I was quite young at the time. And I've always been I just don't really believe in having to pay thousands of dollars to go to school, and I don't think people should be in thousands of dollars of debt to go to school. And it's just not something that I believe in. And so it was really hard for me to even apply and decide to go and start going to school. But it is nice to learn new things and gain other perspectives, which I might not be exposed to if I'm just working.
Is that because knowledge, like the values around knowledge being just freely shared for people, is different for your culture? Is that like a different norm?
Yeah, it is different for sure. And this is something that I've actually experienced recently in my Aboriginal Studies class. They were speaking about the Stony Creek Woman book on Mary John. And in the introduction, in the first chapter, the question that was posed was why carrier people have so much meaning or emphasis on the death of a person in their clan. And as I said in the beginning, my mother is carrier, and that's the culture I'm taught. So what I've been told is that the reason for that is because it's a way for us, the people who are still living, to mourn and to grieve the person who's passed on, as well as it's a way to respect the person who's passed on. And then people would continue to ask me and prod me questions and answers of, it's pretty vague, I would like to know some more. And I'm like, it's not really my role in the community to tell you that. If it was an elder who was being asked that question, it would be different because that is their job. Or if it was a chief, a hereditary chief, that would be different. But it's not my role in my community to share that with you.
Teacher.
I'm just, yeah, it's just not my role. So.
You're in a learner position.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was interesting to see. And even if I did have the knowledge to share with them, like I said, it's not my role in my community to tell you that. So it was interesting to see the perspective from people who are simply not exposed to that.
It can be uncomfortable to be put on a spot within a learning environment from other classmates and then asked to share your knowledge, and that you are not the spokesperson for that knowledge, like you're saying. And it's like a tokenization kind of thing too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah, I haven't.
What is tokenization? Because some of the viewers, as we're going through talking about equity and inclusion, a lot of people treat some of the DEI kind of stuff like a tick box. And so in doing that, sometimes they can call in people to support frameworks or understanding, but how do they do it without tokenizing? And what is tokenizing?
Yeah, it's yeah, I have experienced this a few times before, but not so much in school, at least not yet. And I hope it doesn't, because it's not a fun experience. But I guess I would say tokenization, at least in my experience, is a person in their inequities in the world and their status in the world and who they are as a person, but you don't really like care. It's really to your own benefit, the other party's benefit, and then they don't really care about you as a person. They just see you as somebody that they can say, oh yeah, I know an Indigenous person, I can talk about this. But it's not really the case.
Or we brought one into the group, so we're doing the diversity stuff that we're supposed to, but not actually hearing them to comprehend suggestions or feedback, just having it there to say it's done.
Yeah, which is only perpetuating the system which non-Indigenous people, or yes, I should say white European people, benefit from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to pull another card.
Okay.
Ooh, what is an equity lens and why should we use it? So this card says, an equity lens refers to the process of reviewing practices based on their impact on equity-seeking groups. That can help ensure that your member organization's policies and programs are equitable for all members. The equity lens helps to acknowledge the existence and causes of systemic inequity. The transparent and consistent use of an equity lens enables you to create a culture of accountability and empowerment. It's still vague because I feel it's a little vague still, because it says what is an equity lens, but it's still not fully talking about what are equity-seeking groups. Like those could be groups that have multiple barriers, disabilities, invisible barriers, right? Reasons why they have more struggle than other members of society.
Yeah, an equity lens, just recognizing, I guess, where people are coming from and having genuine interest. And when they do share, you want to be reflective on that, and then also be an active listener and actually listen to them. Because I feel like oftentimes people will listen to me when I'm speaking, when they're asking for my advice or whatever it might be. They're listening, but they won't do anything with what they've listened to. Like they're not reflective with it, which is, I find, when I'm asking my elders for advice or whatever it might be, I find that the stories that they tell me or the perspectives that they share force me to be a little bit more active in my listening, but also it forces me to have more empathy for experiences that are not my own. And that's the way that I've been taught, and it's become invaluable to me. Yeah, it does. It is a transferable skill in which I can use it in my work life, but it's also transferable to the personal relationships that I have and my familial relationships. And it all does fall into community as well, where it just all connects. And I think if you just practice active listening and you recognize where people are coming from and you're reflective on that, I think it certainly does help to create a more equitable world.
I think that equity is one of the hardest things to unpack easily in a conversation.
Yeah, it's not.
And I think that some of the most effective ways that I've seen are experiential things where people can tangibly, viscerally experience it and see it for themselves. One example is in university, they had an equity session done, and everyone started out in a line, and then the facilitator would ask questions about what people had experienced in their life and or realities for them of who they are. And they would have to step up or they'd have to step back. And so some of those were very much like advantageous. Like your family went to university generations before you're going to get ahead 2 more steps. Things like that. You're a first-time person going to university, you would go back a bit. And so there are all kind of variations of questions that are real kind of equity circumstances. And then by the time everyone's done, they look around and see where everybody is at. And that makes equity make more sense because there's an understanding that, okay, so for people who are over here, that's why they need and deserve more services to even get to the starting point for some individuals. So I think that like tangible explanations of equity are more important, but that's often not what's done when we talk about equity or when organizations say, we need equity, we're going to think about that. We're going to make sure there's diversity, equity, inclusion. But what does that really mean? And it's so hard to just say it in an easy summary.
Yeah, it's not, like I said, it is pretty complex and it's going to look different for everybody. And it's going to look different for me than it is for you, but it's also going to look different for me than it is for example, my Pakistani friend who lives in England. It's going to look different for her too. And yeah, it's not something easy to summarize.
It's not. A lot of my own inequities are very invisible too. And so to explain them it's more challenging.
For sure.
Yeah. Like I remember starting university and most of the students would have parents that would help them get books. I was on a youth agreement, like many people that don't get a chance to go to university, or they do, but there's a lot of barriers if they don't have the supports that they need. And just how felt that experience was for me. That is very invisible for those who just go, I'm going to school. They don't realize why they have so much more advantage having familial support. It's really hard to quantify something like that. And because equity is not easily quantifiable, I don't find that there's a lot of solution that's commonly understood. Across the board, this is what we acknowledge about equity and commonly do for it. You don't feel it's a common understanding?
Yeah, I would agree. I think I can't even think of something that could be like generally common, because the first thing I thought of was like classes, but they still cost money, which not everybody has access to. And yeah, I can't even, it's not something I can even think of.
I'm designing a board game on equity, so it's almost done. It's something that I have been very passionate about. But again, it's very hard to articulate it in a conversation because it's required to have lived experience.
Yeah.
Are there any other lived experience aspects that you would share for yourself, or those maybe that you're aware of in their story that you're able to share? Keeping in mind that we're speaking on behalf of others, like social leaders or people in service, that maybe they're not totally familiar why equity matters.
So you're asking some of my own lived experience? Yeah, I don't know, privileged in a lot of ways, but there's obviously some disparities that I've been a part of as well. I grew up, one thing I'm very happy for is that I grew up with two loving parents, which I feel like it's not super common, I feel like. And like I said before, I am adopted, and I'm sure with MTFD not always been super. They claim to protect Indigenous children and they claim to protect children, but that's not always the case. And what they do behind closed doors is, it's hard to talk about, really. And I know a lot of stories of people who, of Indigenous youth who were part of the MCFD system, who were then adopted into white or white passing families, and it didn't really end well for them. And they are just a victim of a colonial system, which MCFD was meant to protect from them. I'm lucky in that I was adopted by another family member, and I can never repay her back for everything she's done for me and continues to do for me. And I do love my mother a lot. Again, that's not always the case for everybody. And then in my teenage years, when I discovered that I am part of the queer community, I identify as queer, it's another whole thing with my mother too, is that she, as loving and supporting as she is, it wasn't something that she really understood or knew about, and so I didn't really have the language for understanding who I was or how I identified. I identify as two-spirit, and that was never a term that I grew up to learn about until I was done high school. Pretty much, I was probably 17 when I learned the term, and I figured out that I was genderqueer long before that, and it definitely. Some learning disabilities as well, which has not been accommodated for as well. So it's, and then, on top of that as well, as like I'm Indigenous in a predominantly white town, and so that comes with its own stuff. So it's hard, and it's gonna be different for everybody. And I feel like I've talked about this before with my friends, but I feel like nobody really gets it. But I'm Indigenous, and I've met other people who are Indigenous who face the same problems that I do as somebody who's Indigenous. And I've met queer people who have dealt with queer, barriers or issues with their families or school or whatever it might be. But I've never met somebody who's Indigenous and queer. And I've never been able to relate to somebody with that. As I know that I've met Indigenous people who face barriers and queer people who face barriers, it's important to recognize the intersectionality and where those meet and how it is a unique experience. Because if I was...
And learning disabilities would also be one.
Yeah.
With those intersectionalities.
You're right, yeah. And so if I was, for example, a white person or a white passing person, I would be treated differently. Or the same would be said of if I didn't identify as queer. If I was a cisgender man, I would be treated differently. And it's hard for people to swallow, but it's the reality of life. And it's just the way that it is. It's something that I believe that we can and we should change, because it affects me, but it affects everybody. And while everybody who is not a white rich man is going to be affected by a colonial system, the fact is that everybody is a victim to the colonial system, and in the end nobody wins.
Yeah.
And it's important that we recognize that.
It's not as advantageous for them because it's built for them and perpetuates the success for people who are able to sustain themselves well in the system designed for themselves.
Yep.
And I want to commend you for being so brave talking about your intersectionality, so that it can give that level of understanding of equity and even what intersectionality is. So thank you. And I remember when I was learning from a scholar around intersectionality, and they said that the intersectionality is more than the sum of all parts. So when you talk about your realities being Indigenous, your realities being queer, and your realities with your learning disabilities, those are all unique and separate, like you said, but then when they conjoined, they're more than the sum of all parts. And that's the reality of intersectionality. And like you said, it's a unique experience for everyone, how that is. In the systemic realm, so say when you're moving forward in life and perhaps you have hopes, goals, dreams, ambitions, or even every little goal is an important goal, right? To move towards what matters to you. And are there ways that things weigh heavier for you as you move towards any of your goals? I know you're quite busy and you're active in the community supporting others and in your education journey. But like what weighs on you through and affects you due to your intersectionalities that could like support service providers could go, that's what someone with that lived experience might need.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's really hard to implement things that sort of matter to those people with that lived experience and those people that need that support. I work with a lot of unhoused people, and I work with a lot of people who are in addictions, and it's hard to quantify what's going to be helpful to them. I guess a lot of people would say, I hear this often, people who work in, how you say, the supportive housing, to continue being patient and kind towards service users. I hear this a lot where service providers will get burnt out, which is another whole thing in and of itself. But once they get burnt out and they continue going to work, it results in inadequate care. And the service users are at the end of that. They're the ones who deal with it.
So adequate care would be being mindful of certain particularities that are showing up for each individual.
Yeah.
And what those individuals are saying they need.
Yep.
Because really, they're the experts in what they need,
Yep.
not anyone else.
Yep.
The person supporting is supporting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked about this before. It is going to look different for everybody, but I think mostly just being kind and compassionate and recognizing when people are talking to you about what they need.
So that's where policy comes into place then, or even grant funding, because like you said, hands can be tied due to what grant funders require as well for what organizations provide. So on the service level, it's being able to hear, taking care of yourself enough to actually hear the individual wanting support and what that is. But oftentimes those service providers can burn out because maybe on the policy level, the policies aren't necessarily indicative of what the people actually need, or they don't actually provide what they need. It's on an upper scale level, systemic level.
Yeah.
So where could policymakers think about how lived experience actually is? What are some things that policymakers could think about?
Yeah, you have good questions. Yeah, there is a huge disconnect, and especially with the voting season upon us, I try to be really active in asking questions to the people I'm hoping to vote for, and just getting their ideas on what they plan to do surrounding certain problems in XYZ communities.
And we can sum it up with saying having a really fundamental equity lens does need to start at the top so it trickles down. But it also does matter with those who may be more discriminatory. So when you talk about people that maybe they don't have the capacity to fill out paperwork, someone who's discriminating them and doesn't understand their multiple barriers could just think they're lazy. And then they don't want to help them. Maybe they ignore their emails or their phone calls because they're just choosing not to help themselves. And so I think that discrimination can really play into why people don't understand equity too.
Yeah, definitely. I agree that it's important that we hold policymakers and politicians accountable, because we all know what happens when we don't hold them accountable. Yeah, that's all I'll say on that.
Okay, I got another card. So what's the difference between equality and equity? And so we often see this image that shows here with the boxes so that someone can see over the fence. Equality seeks to give everyone the same opportunities. However, equity seeks to give everyone the same opportunities while recognizing their unique situation and addressing systemic barriers such as socioeconomic upbringing. So that's just one example.
Yeah. I don't think that there's any other way to explain that. Yeah, it's just thinking that if we just gave everybody the same stuff, that everybody's going to succeed in the same way, but it's not the case, because it's not the way the system was made. And it's just making sure that we recognize people's unique situations and accommodating them for that so that they do succeed in a way that matters to them.
We could think about it like, say, for persons with autism. If they are going to school every day, but they don't have a space where they can have dim lights, if that has taken up all of their capacity because they're using fluorescent lights, then they're not going to succeed as well in school. So they're already at a deficit with their peers. But if there was a small change, such as accommodating even a section of the classroom that has dimmer lights, now they're striving and they're able to succeed as much as their peers. That would be an example of equity in play.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, at least in my experience in our university and college, is that they don't really have a space for that or really accommodate people who might request dimmer lights or other people who have specific needs to succeed in school. I know I definitely need more support in my classes I was looking for some tutors, but they only allow two meetings per week at 30 minutes a meeting. But I just think it would help if there were more time slots or more accommodations set for other people who might request that.
Yeah. I'm going to pull another one. Ooh. What is cultural appropriation? Theft of cultural elements for one's own use, commodification, or profit, including symbols, art, language, customs, etc., often without understanding, acknowledgement, or respect for its value in the original culture. The dominant culture will assume their right to take the non-dominant culture's elements. It's not really equity related, but it's certainly important because we did talk about tokenization. So what is the difference between tokenization and cultural appropriation?
I guess how I would see it is tokenization, as we spoke about before, is acting as if you know the person and acting as if you know the culture. And then, because you benefit from that, being able to tell your friends or your colleagues that you can speak on this because you know somebody that way. Whereas I feel like cultural appropriation is definitely it's even more disconnected, more like further removed from it even. I think the one huge thing that I could think of is in movies. We see a lot of cultural appropriation, especially in the early 1990s and early 2000s. A lot of cultural appropriation of all sorts of cultures where they wear a certain costume, where they act a certain way of a certain person, gender or race, etc. And then they don't really address it in the movie at all, or in the credits, or in any interviews afterwards. And it's, just being more, even more disconnected from it, while still they benefit from it and they make money off of it in the movies and stuff.
It's gotten better now. Like they used to have non-Indigenous actors and depict them as though they're Indigenous in the movies.
Yeah, I've seen that quite a lot in the movie. I guess it's documentary. Are you familiar with The Real Engine?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they highlight a lot of times where so basically from the start when Indigenous people have first been shown in or portrayed in movies to like the late 1990s, because it came out in 2006 or something. And they highlighted all sorts of different experiences and filmmakers, etc., about why they chose that and what the intention was, what the intended message.
Yeah, they used like bandanas as because it was for Hollywood, it kept the hair back, but it wasn't actually a depiction of how Indigenous people would wear their hair. It wasn't traditionally ever used to have headbands across the forehead.
Yeah.
Which then became a stereotype and like an associative norm that even Indigenous people would replicate by doing this, thinking it was representing themselves.
Yeah. And you're right that it's in recent years it's definitely gotten better, but it's a step in the right direction. But I feel like it's definitely a long way to go in how they can be more inclusive and diverse in who they cast in movies.
And the power of media of how it depicts and creates and maintains social norms, because those stereotypes or those social norms or how people then assume or think maybe like how they can be more equitable because they understand what people's needs without actually hearing from the community themselves. Because community really should be the ones guiding what they need.
Mm-hmm. For sure. As you were saying that, I was thinking about the movie Killers of the Flower Moon with Lily Gladstone and Leonardo DiCaprio. The book was I don't know if you know this, but the book was surrounded around Lily's viewpoint, and you can see the difference in the movie. Despite it being 3.5 hours long, Lily Gladstone is not on the screen as much as Leonardo DiCaprio is. It's interesting to see because later that year, after it came out, the Oscars were playing, and everybody was buzzing because Emma Stone had come out with some of her best works, but Lily Gladstone, some would argue and would still argue that her performance in Killers of the Flower Moon is her best. And I think for the first time, an Indigenous woman had been on the big screen. It's interesting to see how the world reacted to that, and especially like mainstream Hollywood. And they didn't, at least in my experience, I don't know the Osage people, but in my experience, they portrayed her in a way that was accurate and true. And it was interesting to see because they also had their music team, the drummers up there, were nominated for Best Music Score. And so at the Oscars, they usually play the music scores, the nominations up on that stage. And they played the drummers up there. And I remember watching it and seeing my matriarchs and seeing the dancers and the drummers up on the biggest stage, the most recorded stage in all of Hollywood history, and it was something that I'd never experienced in my life. Is like seeing, as you said, I just feel like people underestimate the power it is to see somebody like you succeed in a way that's historically been unattainable. And it was so powerful to me to see Lily Gladstone up there on that stage and see the drummers up there as well, because it was reflective of what I grew up with, going to powwows and seeing those big drums and my dancers and my matriarchs, and seeing, yeah, like I said, Lily Gladstone succeed in a way that's historically never been done before, at least not as a respectful way. It was phenomenal to see her up there. And yeah, it does, representation does matter, I feel like, for sure.
And that makes a more equitable world because it should be shared by all.
For sure. Definitely.
And you light up when you talk about it. And it's nice to see when they talk about how little girls or little boys or trans people need to be able to see themselves reflected back to them. I think that the times have changed a lot in that way, and that they'll be required to now be equitable and diverse and inclusive. I don't think it's going to regress, that's for sure. It's just going to increase, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. I think in terms of Hollywood and movie makers, it's one step in the right direction, but there's still lots of work to do. And I would like to believe, too, that I am hopeful that it's just going to go the right direction, not backwards. And while it's not necessarily directly linked to equity or a more equitable world, it does matter because everybody's attached to their screens and everybody's watching the celebrities and what they're doing. And like we talked about, representation does matter. Yeah. I would also like to think that it's just going to go forwards and go up from here.
I'm going to pull the last one. What does diversity entail? Diversity is about the individual. It is about the variety of unique dimensions, qualities, identities, and characteristics we all possess. Diversity recognizes individual differences that can include age, race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, gender identity, disability, sexual orientation, culture, ideology, politics, religion, citizenship, marital status, parental status, body size, etc. So diversity is all the variations of being a human being.
Yeah, I guess in essence, yeah. It's the same thing as equity. It's hard to quantify what it's going to look like in a conversation or just on paper. But yeah, I guess all the human traits to exist. Yep.
So equity is, hey, there's all these variations and we're going to be conscious and aware of everything to make sure it's all fair all the time, which can be hard. It can be a challenge to do it properly, to do it well. And what does that even mean, to do it properly? Because no matter what, we make mistakes as human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually just talking to my friend Caitlin about this, just that I think it's important that we know our own histories, and I think it's important that we know where we come from and who we are and what that means to us. But I also think it's important to be kind and to be compassionate, because at the end of the day, we're all just humans, and it's the first time we're all being alive, and we're going to be making mistakes, and that's just part of life.
Yeah.
So it's important to recognize that we're all just doing our best.
Yeah, for sure. I know. I agree. I think when it becomes an issue is when people say, why does that matter? Because they don't realize they've never put themselves in anyone else's shoes than themselves. And they just think that's the way life is. This is we got good Canada, this is a good country, and all the norms are good. They work for me. They should work for everyone. I don't understand why it matters. I don't understand why we have to do this. And then I find that's when it's problematic.
Yep. Yeah. When it's harmful or dismissive, or it acts as if the system is, how do you say? As if the system is good in any way, as if it has any redeemable traits, which of course it does. Of course it has stuff that's good about it, but it doesn't mean that it's going to work for everybody. And that's just the reality. Yeah.
It's built too for people who can strive and succeed in capitalism and being productive, in having good high executive functioning, so very capable and able all the time, and to also shut down emotion and just show up and do your job, and then you get your paycheck, and then you can sustain your life and pay your bills.
Yeah, which is not the case for everybody.
That's right.
For a large amount of people, it's not the case.
Yeah. And then you can also see your stories depicted in the literature when you go to school, and in your history when you go to school, and even in pop culture, media. So that is part of equity for sure. And that's mirrored back to you so that you know who you are. You get a mirror back for who you are, so you know how to move forward and show up in the world and to be received and accepted and have belonging. And all people have an inherent need for belonging and acceptance. It's primal because we're social mammals. So it's very fundamental to witness oneself be able to grow with a culture and not necessarily have to cut off parts of them in order to get that belonging and acceptance. And I think that's when it leads to more crises for people, leads to more struggle for people, because it impacts the mental health then. If you're having to cut off parts of yourself in order to fit in and belong, or you're shutting down from saying what you really think or what you really feel or what you really need because it's not safe to, or because they won't understand, then over time it affects somebody's mental well-being. Mm-hmm. And so it's so important to have these conversations and to be able to have these conversations across the board for any group that's in the society, in our community, that's dealing with other human beings. Yeah.
Yeah, you said it beautifully. There's nothing for me to add. I agree with that. That's all I can say.
Nice. Are you creative?
I used to be pretty creative, but I feel like I don't really have time for it.
Ooh, did you ever write or anything?
Oh yeah, I have some published works actually through the college.
That's amazing. I just had this idea. What if we wrote a poem together? It could be short, but we could write a poem together. But what do you think we did, like an equity poem? Does that feel too daunting? Like, I could start it. You could help.
The way forward, more than a checkbox.
Love it.
Is
collaborative.
More than a checkbox.
We are collaborative. You reading it, right? Because I love how you read it.
I feel like we need to put a checkbox at the end of that.
Okay. You're going to read it out loud, right?
You want me to?
Yeah. So because all of these topics are so well expressed in the arts, and I feel like that's why arts and culture is so important for individuals who do live on the fringe of mainstream society, because then you're able to really see and experience. So it was so fun. We wrote a poem together in collaboration of what we talked about.
Yeah. The name of it, we decided, is The Way Forward is More Than a Checkbox. And 3 stanzas here, so I'll read it. Equity as a collaborative effort, creating a beautiful step forward. Clever voices at the table, making progress more than a fable. Together, motivating change in Prince George, sharing experiences takes courage. Dedicating in new ways what it means for all of us, what it means for all to flourish. System shifts, entering new days, forgiving pasts to now trailblaze, to imagine a future where we all belong, so that we realize that it's diversity that makes us strong. Yeah.
Yay. Thanks so much for coming on today. That was really, really great to have conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's been a really good experience.
Great. I'm glad. Yeah. I hope you can do more and get out there in the community. You're doing important work and you have really important perspectives.
For sure. I definitely, I think it's important, and I think it's important that we showcase that as well to the world, because I don't know, if we don't show that the work's being done, then how do we know?
Yeah. Are there any last thoughts on just inspiration that you hope anyone tuning in can get if they're working with other people in the community? What are some last little gleams that they can take from your wisdom?
Yeah, I think just being receptive in your listening and being intentional with your words and recognizing where you're coming from and being patient with others, just being super receptive. Yeah, I think that's what I would say.
That's great advice. Thank you.